Faculty of Science MFN of the University of Turin since 1983. From 1988 to 2002, he was president of the Confraternity of the Holy Shroud of Turin and of the International Center of Syndonology of Turin. And from 2002 through now, he's been the scientific director of the International Center of Syndonology. He has been a member of the Scientific Committee for the Conservation of the Shroud since 1991, and he contributed to the design and realization of the new system of conservation of the Shroud from 1992 through 2002. He has been a member of the Diocesan Committee for the Shroud since its foundation in 2002, which has the function to work together with the papal custodian of the Holy Shroud, that is the Archbishop of Turin, in order to realize any activity concerning the Shroud. He worked for the expositions of the Shroud in 78, 98, 2000, 2010, and also in 2013 as a member of the committees charged of their organization. He has more than 150 papers on the Shroud published in national and international journals and magazines. He's given over 2,300 lectures on the Shroud in Italy and abroad. We're very pleased to have with us Professor Bruno Barberis.
Good morning to everyone. And first of all, I wanted to thank very much Joe Marino and all the members of the conference committee for having invited me to speak at this beautiful and important congress in St. Louis. Then I wish to greet all the attendees also on behalf of Monsignor Cesare Nosiglia, Archbishop of Turin, and the papal custodian of the Holy Shroud, and also of the steering committee of the International Center of Syndonology of Turin. Well, May 25 and 28, 1898. The lawyer Secondo Pia takes the first photograph of the Shroud with this machine, with this camera. It's not possible. When you will come to the museum in Torino, you can see it shown in the museum. These dates are, without any doubt, a milestone in the history of the Shroud, since it's from them then began a completely new and fascinating period, the period of the scientific history of the Shroud. In the last 100 and more years, reams and reams have been written about the research performed on the Shroud, and today the Shroud bibliography has thousands, probably 100,000, of works written and published in all the continents. One of the most interesting and characteristic aspects of these studies is that the argument Shroud necessarily combines both scientific and religious themes and interests. As a lot of the conference of this Congress and have very widely underlined. This obviously doesn't have anything negative. On the contrary, it has an enormous charm and interest. Often, however, you run the risk of confusing or inappropriately blending the two levels, with the results of removing value and validity to the statement, especially when you make the serious mistake of tackling religious problems with scientific methods and conversely scientific problems with religious methods. Another serious risk is to let that personal beliefs regarding faith can influence the results of scientific studies. This often leads to forced conclusions due to the will to prove at all costs preconceived theses or to counter a priori those theses that do not coincide with our convictions. This runs the risk of falling into a fundamentalism that is anything but serious scientific research, and that often causes confusion among the readers who have the impression of watching a war between opposing arguments rather than a serious and rigorous dialogue, which can also be tightened, but that in order to be really scientific, it must be constructive, respectful of others' opinions, and marked only by the search of truth. The task of the serious scientist is to inform correctly, always distinguishing between sure news and data, and assumptions based on data and documents only in part or not at all reliable. Many of the studies done on the Shroud are vitiated in whole or in part by these problems. And it's not always easy to distinguish at first sight and clearly among those absolutely serious and rigorous and those that aren't. There is no doubt that recent decades have been characterized by a remarkably lively debate about the Shroud, perhaps as never before in the past, helped by the exceptional sounding board provided by modern means of communication. This debate has been triggered by the several studies carried out on the Shroud, and mainly by the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud cloth made in 88, the result of which, the medieval dating of the Shroud, has sparked a heated debate not only among scientists and scholars, but also in public opinion. In reality, at the bottom of this debate, there is another one of far greater thickness and older, the controversy between the two opposite Shroud fundamentalism. The one that supports the absolute certainty of the identity between the Shroud and the burial cloth of Jesus, and the one that reckons that there is no correlation between the two objects. It is obvious that everyone is free to propose and defend one's own thesis, but it is also equally natural that such a defense must respect the logical criteria of modern science and of modern dialogue. On the contrary, we often watch discussions and debates in which people start from absolutely arbitrary and preconceived hypotheses, using arguments that go against the most elementary rules of logic and arrive at conclusions absolutely unprovable. In this field, the literature is very wide, ranging from the statement that on the Shroud is painted a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, to the one that it is the work of a medieval forger who used techniques which are unknown for us, men and women of the third millennium, to the one that believes that the Shroud is the scientific proof of the resurrection. This is the correct word. The scientific proof of the resurrection, that is the result of a radiation characteristic of the resurrection, as if the resurrection were a natural event and therefore testable by scientific methods. And the list could go on much, much longer. To force the end of the scientific data or to neglect them completely and start from absolutely baseless hypotheses is equivalent to damage and discredit the meaning and the message of the Shroud that make it an object unique in the world, as we know very well. The serious and correct scholar detests the crusades for or against the authenticity of the Shroud image, made for the sole purpose of convincing most people of one's own beliefs without bringing any proof or producing reasons that are in conflict with the most elementary rationality. To start from the assumption that the shroud is at any cost the burial cloth of Christ, and try to prove it at all costs without taking care to give serious and objective reasons, or on the contrary, to start from the assumption that the shroud is the work of a medieval forger and do the same means not only to perform a scientifically incorrect operation, but also to make fun of all those who take these conclusions on trust. The only serious and honest behavior is that of one who, desiring only to know the truth, sets humbly to his research, without pretending to demonstrate any preconceived thesis, and indeed rejecting everything that cannot be seriously and scientifically proven. On this road, we should be guided by the clear and eloquent words of Saint John Paul II, who said in front of the shroud on May 24, 1998, during his official visit to the shroud, "The Church urges the scientist that the shroud be studied without pre-established positions that take for granted results that are not such. She invites them to act with interior freedom and attentive respect for both the scientific methodology and the sensibilities of believers." Are very, very clear words. It's not enough, it's not necessary any comment. The discussion on the shroud necessarily obliges us to enter into the theme of the relationship between science and religion, or faith and reason. A very topical subject, as our age is often characterized by manifest contradictions and conflicts in this regard. The spread of internet, television debates, newspaper articles have greatly contributed to spread these topics even among people that hardly would read books on this subject. There is, however, also a strong risk of a widespread misinformation, because very often those who are called to speak on these topics are far to be experts, and often do not shine nor for objectivity nor for methodological rigor. So often we witness the debates, fights, in which a priori theories and opinions are argued, and where the seriousness and rigor of reasoning are almost always absent. Rarely there is a serious reflection on these two words, the word of science and the word of faith, and on their peculiarities, in order to bring clarity and to check whether there is a real possibility of constructive dialogue and integration. Here is, in fact, the essential point. Is it true, as someone argues, that science and faith can only be incompatible? Is it true that scientific discoveries can make a man capable of knowing the whole truth about his existence and about the meaning of everything is around us? And is it true that therefore faith can best be relegated to a purely subjective and private fact? An American scholar, Ian Barbour, listed 4 different types of possible relationship between science and faith: conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. Today, it seems that the first two are prevailing. But it is natural to ask ourselves, would it be possible to create a constructive and fruitful dialogue between science and faith, even a real their integration in an interdisciplinary perspective? These are questions and issues that affect us as members of the society in which we live, but also and above all as individuals. They oblige us to think seriously because they are the basis of our humanity, and the question of the ultimate meaning of our existence in this boundless universe that surrounds us is unavoidable and fundamental. A scholar who frequently appeared on the subject in several books, official documents, and speeches is Professor Joseph Ratzinger, the Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI. Among them, I would like to remember the beautiful conference held in Turin on June 12, 1998, some days before the visit of Pope John Paul II, on the occasion of his pilgrimage to the Shroud. The then prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith said, "If a man cannot reasonably question himself about the essentials of his life, his origin, and his destiny, on what should and can do about life and death, but he must leave these decisive problems to an issue separate from reason, then it doesn't raise reason, but removes its dignity. The disintegration of man thus introduced at the same time gives rise to the pathology of religion and to the pathology of science." And he concluded, "There is no alternative. Reason and religion must return together without dissolving one into the other. It's the man which is in question, is the word which is in question." Personally, I never thought that between science and faith there can be any kind of incompatibility, provided that there is always mutual respect between the respective areas. Science is a source of values that are in communion and not in contrast to those of faith. In every field of science, man, thanks to his studies and his research, has gradually become aware of being the repository of a unique privilege, that of being able to decipher the logic of the universe, that is, of the world in which we live. On the other hand, science cannot lead to the demonstration of the existence of God, but even to prove its not existence. Science can only deal with the immanent reality, that is, with the phenomena that occur in nature. Faith is a gift of God and allows us to penetrate the world of the transcendent in the attempt to understand and grasp its meaning. Very famous are the words through which 4 centuries ago Galileo Galilei expressed the clear division of functions between science and faith, and at the same time their complementarity. The intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how the heaven goes. It was very clear. And he understood very well the deep point of the problem. And more, the Holy Scripture and nature go both from the divine word, the former as the dictation of the Holy Spirit, and the latter as a very faithful executor of the commands of God. Another example. If reading the first chapters of Genesis, we pretend to find a scientifically correct description of the formation of the universe and of the development of life on Earth, we would make a big mistake of judgment, since these texts represent a great theological reflection written by authors who lived many centuries before Christ, and not a treatise on cosmology. Science and faith are both gifts of God, said St. Pope John Paul II at the Congress of the World Federation of Scientists. It's true. It's obviously true, because both of them have their roots in a wonderful gift that the Creator gave to man, reason. Science and faith are therefore both essential in order that man can progress in knowledge in a comprehensive manner, developing his whole being and not just a part of it. Let's now return to the Shroud. Its study necessarily involves a comparison between science and faith. In fact, the reading, study, and meditation on the image of the Shroud lead essentially to two levels of reflection. On the one hand, the study of the image has a high interest from the scientific point of view. Especially in the past 40-45 years, scientists tried to understand in depth its characteristics and origin, launching studies in several different fields of science: physics, chemistry, biology, computer science, forensic science, statistics, and so on. In recent years, the Shroud was therefore at the center of a wide, complex, and heated scientific debate at a multidisciplinary level. And a big number of the speeches at this Congress prove this fact very clearly. On the other hand, the tradition always identified the Shroud with the burial sheet of Jesus of Nazareth, and in more recent times, this identification has taken advantage of modern exegetic studies with significant results. This obviously involved the field of Christian faith, thus opening a heated debate on the relationship between faith and Shroud. The most recent exposition of the Shroud, 98, 2000, 2010, further contributed to highlight the pastoral and spiritual meaning of the Shroud. Of course, the two ways of understanding the research on the Shroud are often met, but also clashed, sometimes dividing both the insiders and common people. The Shroud is an object of faith and veneration, or an object of scientific interest. Often, in these last years, the two modes of approaching the Shroud have been put in contrast, as if one necessarily excludes the other as mutually incompatible. It has grown in this way a very animated discussion, perhaps as never before, favored both by modern means of communication and by the great worldwide interest arisen by the last exposition of the Shroud. For scientific approach to the Shroud is usually understood that according to which the Shroud is regarded solely as an object of study, and for which the all-important issue is to try to answer the question about its origin and its authenticity. No more. A pastoral approach to the Shroud means the reading of the Shroud in the light of its intrinsic message, that starting from its close and indisputable relationship with the Holy Scriptures, becomes a valuable and unique inspirer of the life of faith and the prompter of those works of charity which are its real big fruit. In this regard, at the end of his aforementioned speech in front of the Shroud in 98, St. John Paul II said, "May the Spirit of God, who dwells in our hearts, instill in everyone the desire and generosity necessary for accepting the Shroud message and for making it the decisive inspiration of our lives." The decisive inspiration of our lives. Therefore, to put in antithesis the scientific approach to the religious one is very dangerous, because you run the risk, on one hand, to reduce the Shroud to a dead object, to an image that has meaning only in itself and that doesn't at all challenge our lives, and on the other, to turn the Shroud into a kind of idol, slaved to a priori and instrumental thesis. I am deeply, deeply convinced that to leave the presentation of the Shroud to a sole scientific approach or to a sole pastoral approach is neither correct nor useful for any kind of recipient. But then, are these two ways of approaching the image of the Shroud really antithetic? I personally think that the two approaches are not only compatible, but rather complementary, forming the two sides both indispensable of a correct, effective, and comprehensive presentation of the Shroud. They may very well coexist, provided that their different levels of competence were respected. In this regard, to avoid any misunderstanding, it is important to recall that the Christian faith is not based, and never it will be based, on the Shroud. It's obvious, but not for all. Not for all. Because several times I was asked by journalists and interviewers what would happen to my faith in the event that the non-authenticity of the Shroud was proven. And of course, I always replied that it would not change anything. The Christian faith is based on very different assumptions, but the Shroud can be a valuable support when it is seen as a valuable tool that, through the language of images, helps to reflect on the pillar of the Christian faith, the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. To all those who put themselves in front of the Shroud, free from preconception and prejudices, a correct presentation gives the opportunity to follow a valuable journey of reflection in search of the mystery of the Passion of Jesus, which is narrated in the Gospel in a literary form. This path needs to be supported by confirmations and discoveries coming from the scientific studies of the image of the Shroud, yes, sure. But it needs to be supported also by the reflection that allows us to go beyond the image, to grasp in its entirety the message of salvation and redemption given to us by Christ's suffering in the long and painful journey of his passion. Therefore, the Shroud absolutely needs to be studied and understood by following both the two approaches, that of science and that of faith. Otherwise, it will be impossible to fully grasp and deepen the profound message of the Shroud. I conclude simply by saying goodbye to everyone in Turin at the next exposition of the Shroud between April 19 to June 24 of next year. Thank you very much.
14 years.